We're thrilled that we have leaders from the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs here with us today. At the same time, there are others in Washington who have a vested interest in the conversation we're going to have today and hopefully the work we'll do together ahead. And specifically here, I'm referring to our partners in Congress. And to that end, two of those partners, Senator Jon Tester and Senator John Boozman, requested the opportunity to share a short message with all of you.
This is Senator Jon Tester, and while I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, I am grateful for the opportunity to share a few words. I want to start by thanking Syracuse University for putting on this important event to recognize our veterans and all volunteer military. I'd especially like to recognize University of Montana's very own Seth Bodner for being here today. If we want to maintain our all-volunteer military, we've got to keep our end of the bargain and provide assistance when it's time to take off the uniform and adjust back to civilian life. We made great strides last Congress towards keeping that commitment and providing VA the tools it needs to provide earned benefits and care. I'm particularly proud we were successful in delivering toxic-exposed veterans historic support under the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson honoring our PACT Act. We also passed several bills to deliver student veterans education benefits in times of emergency and expand the popular Vet Success on Campus program. We even made it easier for veterans to get connected with critical apprenticeships and on-the-job training opportunities. But we still have more work to do. This means continuing our efforts to provide better education and employment opportunities for veterans, transitioning service members, and their families. That's why I'm leading the bipartisan effort to expand federal employment opportunities in Customs and Border Patrol through the SkillBridge program, so that it may serve as a critical pipeline to hire some of the more than 200,000 transitioning service members each year. This bill will strengthen our borders, all while connecting these folks with meaningful employment. As chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, ensuring you have the tools you need to succeed here at home is my top priority. America is watching, and keeping our promises to those who serve is critical to making future generations continue that tradition of service. We've got to deliver stronger access to the quality education, jobs, benefits, and the care you deserve, and have earned because our all-volunteer military depends on these things to happen. So thank you all for protecting our country, and know that I'll keep fighting to do right by our past, current, and future men and women in uniform.
Hi, I'm Arkansas Senator John Boozman. I want to thank Syracuse University Chancellor Kent Severud and the University of Tennessee for their leadership in co-hosting this summit on the role of higher education and the future of the all-volunteer force. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you, but I'm confident your engagement will help enhance our military, veteran community all across the country. Your participation today demonstrates a willingness to be part of the necessary work to better support our nation's heroes. I applaud the efforts underway at Syracuse University, including new state-of-the-art National Veterans Resource Center at the Daniel and Gail Yellow Building. I understand how rare and difficult it is to convene so many senior university and government leaders in one location. But this event presents certainly a unique opportunity for collaboration and innovation that can strengthen our national defense. I wanted to acknowledge and thank the collection of university leaders represented here for your commitment to this endeavor. I'm also pleased to know that the Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs are actively participating in these discussions, because it truly takes all of us working together to make a difference. As you know, this year marks the 50th anniversary of America's all-volunteer military. This comes at a time when we're experiencing challenges in recruiting American youth to serve. Sustaining and ensuring the future of the all-volunteer military is critical to our national security and economic future, and higher education certainly has an opportunity to play a role in supporting the human capital and innovation needs for the U.S. to remain competitive, for generations to come. I encourage higher education institutions and the DoD to partner together to develop human capital and inspire service. I believe that working together, we can solve today's challenges and any others that arise to secure the future of our all-volunteer force. As a son of a World War II veteran who served more than 20 years in the Air Force, this issue is certainly important to me. I know my colleagues in Congress are paying close attention to this challenge and will closely be following your actions that you will take in the coming months to encourage young Americans to pursue serving our nation in uniform. I applaud you for coming together to be a leader on this issue. I look forward to hearing about the progress from the summit. Thank you all for your commitment to our national defense and for all you're doing to solve the problem, protect our country's armed forces, and provide opportunities to future generations of Americans.
So, to kick off this morning, I'd like to welcome Sean O'Keefe and Bernard Rosker to the stage. As they're coming up, I'll make some brief introductions. Sean O'Keefe holds the title of University Professor at Syracuse University, the highest faculty rank conferred by the institution. Sean is the Fanstiel Chair in Leadership at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Sean's list of leadership roles prior to coming home to Syracuse University is, let's just say, extensive. Served as Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget and Assistant to the President, Comptroller and CFO, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of the Navy, Administrator of NASA, the Chancellor of Louisiana State University, and the Chairman and CEO of Airbus. When I feel complacent about where I am in my life, I read Sean's resume as motivation. And while Sean will probably scold me later for highlighting this news, tonight at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., Sean will be among the 5th class of inductees to the federal government's Hall of Fame. Welcome, Sean. Please have a seat. Both of you have a seat. Joining Sean on stage is another accomplished leader, Bernard Rosker. Bernie is a senior fellow at RAND, where he has served as associate director of the Arroyo Center and director of the Defense Manpower Research Center. His work at RAND has focused on medical care for wounded service members, managing the all-volunteer force, and reform of the military personnel system. Bernie formerly served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, as Undersecretary of the Army, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, and as Director of the Selective Service System. Bernie's a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and earned his PhD in economics from, of course, Syracuse University. I want to use this opportunity to also thank Bernie and his wife Louise, who's also here with us, for their generosity in last year establishing a university-wide dissertation research fund here at Syracuse. This fund provides support to doctoral students pursuing research in any discipline on topics impacting veterans and military-connected families. And in fact, our 5 inaugural fellows have joined us here today and will be with all of you supporting our breakout sessions later. So with that, Sean and Bernie, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this really important conference. I mean, this really celebrates the anniversary of an event half century ago, which really did change the overall context of service in the military in the United States. And it was a seminal moment and an important time to make that critical transition from a conscription force to one that is a all-volunteer force today. Everybody's there because they want to be. And that's a critical distinction, I think, that really was important. I think Chancellor Severud and Provost Zomchik really set the tone exactly of what we're hoping to achieve here today. in the course of this discussion. And Bernie, our ambitious task is to chase, the history a little bit of how we got here, what the current challenges are we're wrestling with and what we've got to confront. And in so many ways, you're the perfect guy to do that. You've literally written the book on the evolution of this entire very ambitious policy of an all-volunteer force, and researched this particular activity over the course of time and lived it in many of its chapters by virtue of your service, not only in the Pentagon, but also leading the Selective Service. As a result, all of that, I think the combination gives us a chance then to talk a little bit about the key issue that the Chancellor and the Provost talked about of how higher education can really contribute more meaningfully and more extensively to this evolving set of challenges that go along with maintaining a citizen soldier opportunity in the policy and how it's constructed. So with that, let's get started, Bernie, on just a little bit of a history of bring us back to an understanding of the conditions and the issues that were present at the time 50 years ago when the determination was made to end the draft, to eliminate conscription as a fundamental piece of the fabric of recruitment of military force, and converting it to one that would be an attractive opportunity for folks as citizens of the United States to want to be part of in the course of a short period, a career, or whatever else was involved. It was a very different time at that juncture. And at that stage, so much of what started here, Bernie, you were very much involved and immersed in the task of completing dissertations and working your way through your doctorate here at Syracuse, but in very short order thereafter, found yourself right in the middle of an awful lot of this. So in the implementation phase of exactly how this would evolve. So having been there at the formative start of much of what we see today, walk us through a little bit some of the imperatives that created and motivated the national leadership to make this determination.
Sure. I left campus here in 1968 to fulfill my ROTC commitment and was posted to the Pentagon. And that was the end of the Democratic administration, and Mr. President Nixon became president. And part of his campaign was a promise to consider the movement away from conscription. In fact, when he became president, two lines were established. One was to reform the Selective Service system, and the other was to test the proposition through the Gates Commission as to whether an all-volunteer force was possible. And I, as a young, at that time, lieutenant in the systems analysis, the remains of McNamara's WizKids office, was part of a team that was establishing the DoD position on moving to a volunteer force. Sam Nunn maintained that the volunteer force came about because of the Vietnam War, and that was true to a large extent. But what really drove us to a volunteer force was the fact that in peacetime, the drafting population, the population to be drafted was much smaller than the eligible population. And as a result, there was a sense that there was no fairness in the draft. Through our history, we've had conscription 4 times. 2 times it's failed, and 2 times it's been a success in the 2 world wars. And it was a success because of the sense of shared commitment and equal sacrifice. And when you're drafting 1 out of 20, 1 out of 5 during wartime, there's no sense of equal sacrifice. serving your country or being forced to serve your country is a matter of luck, and that was not sustainable. Let me say, bringing that forward today, because a lot of the criticism of the all-volunteer force is a sense that if it's not working, we should be returning to conscription. We should not be returning to conscription. We have 4 million young men and women who turn 18 years each year, and the entire requirement of the Defense Department is 150,000. Where's the sense of equal sacrifice for being drafted? It's not there. So we have to make this work. Sean mentioned that the rather short book I wrote, a mere 800 pages, is entitled, I Want You, The Evolution of the All-Volunteer Force. There is no event 50 years that we put a period against. It is a living policy. We traded the certainty of putting a draft call out for the difficulties of working in the marketplace. There's a tone here that we are in crisis because of the demographics and changes in propensities to want to join, as measured by questions given to young population. That is not new. That is the evolution. And we've been in much more dire positions relative to recruiting in the past than we are today. Let me share with you a couple of pieces of information. We often talk about the size of the 18-year-old population and the propensity to drop from 12% to 8% or whatever the number is. You might be interested to know that only about half of Army recruits come directly from high school. The other half have been out in the world of work. They've gone to colleges. They've tried work. And for some reason, that hasn't necessarily worked out for them. And the military, particularly the Army, represents a tremendous opportunity for a second chance. And so when we look at the eligible population to join the Army, it's not 18-year-olds, 2 million men, 2 million females. It's generally the entire population from 18 to 30, and that's tens of millions of people. So that's what we should be focusing on. And let me suggest universities also should be focusing on. It's not just our competition for the 18-year-olds. We have to serve a much larger population. The AVF is well and has done extremely well. We've fought 3 wars without reverting to conscription. Never thought we'd be able to do that. We've maintained end strength, not in the face of shortages of enlistees, by superb retention. It's typical that a service will have 120% of their goal in retention. We've changed the whole nature of the force to be a professional, highly effective force, and I think that is the story, really the history of the all-volunteer force, how it's changed the internal structure. And just one more point, Sean. You heard last night about how the military is the great melting pot. Well, it was always suggested that we needed conscription to create the great melting pot. But our speaker last night talked about that melting pot being the product of a volunteer force. And I think that is where we are. Now, that doesn't suggest that this conference is not timely or needed for both sets of institutions, but it is not We're doing this not because we have a crisis about the real future of the all-volunteer force. So long answer to your...
Not at all. In the early framework here of what led to the conclusions to move away from conscription, find another alternative, and work through it, there were several different options that really were vetted. And again, you've explored that extensively in your book, and the research that you've done looking through this. And again, in many of the early capacities in which you served in public service, had to wrestle with some of the challenges of that, because in part the context of those who served, and this is not a statement across the board to everybody who served at that period, but there was a range of different disciplinary issues that had to be enforced, challenges with any number of folks who had been conscripted and did not, as a fundamental proposition, want to be there, and made it a point to make it their business to make it as disruptive as possible to do it. So some of the challenges that the leadership and the military services dealt with were more disciplinary in nature, trying to really instill a sense of responsibility, all the other fundamentals.
Well, the chief is...
But it made it very, very difficult to actually complete the operations, to stay focused on the task. And that's when standards were born. The idea of saying, this is what we're looking for as a fundamental set of criteria in order to accomplish.
Well, the chief of staff at the time was General Westmoreland, and he had been the commander in Vietnam, and very much the Army's initial position was very much in support of going to a volunteer force. It had wrecked the Army. As we moved away from that time, the Army's position sort of changed. And literally, Mel Laird had Westmoreland for lunch one day at the White House. Mel Laird was the Secretary of Defense, and he tells the story that he said to Westmoreland, "You can support the volunteer force or I'll take your resignation." And Westmoreland moved the Army to tacitly supporting it. But when we actually moved in 1973, there were charges that the Army was sabotaging the all-volunteer force. Recruiters were moved out of minority neighborhoods. Standards were changed. And we had the rest of the decade until the 1979, really. It was a tough call. We had a test which was misnormed, so we really did allow in large numbers of people that we didn't want. And interestingly, the two people who saved the volunteer force were the ranking member in the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Warner, and the chairman, Sam Nunn. The two biggest critics of the volunteer force were the ones who pushed through a sizable pay change, and that was with a double down by President Reagan afterwards. And that gave us the financial position that sustained us through the 1980s. And then the test came in the Gulf War. And we were projecting 10,000 casualties. We ordered 10,000 body bags. And the number of casualties was about 120. And we destroyed one of the largest armies in the world in 100 hours. If you want to see what a conscripted force can do, just look at the Russians today and see how they are performing versus what still is a largely volunteer force on the other side.
No question. There's no doubt about that. And it's in so many ways what has, again, as you've literally put together the framework for, this has evolved an awful lot from real reticence and opposition to an all-volunteer force to one in which now it's viewed as a critical kind of function for the purpose of really motivating folks who are interested in service, being part of it. But that then has narrowed the focus of the interested, if you will, cohort. The data that you presented was right on the mark. It's a much larger collective of folks within an age group, but nonetheless, what we typically find now is more often than not, the recruits that are coming into the force are those with some family legacy of service.
Very much true.
Very strong, strain of that, and it's a tradition among several families for the purpose of requiring, as an expectation, a sense of service to the nation to go forward. Much like we heard last night from Sebastian Younger, some kind of contribution to really lend specifics to Kennedy's intonement that we need to give back something. Our expectation should be every bit as high of our own contributions back as those that we have in the nation. So it's an important phase of what we see today that's involved in this, to maintain that disposition, the focus and the interest, as well as the standards of performance. And I guess, the Gulf War is a very, very strong example that you've cited of how performance can matter a lot in terms of training and capability and dedication to task.
The almost unexpected consequence of the volunteer force is the professionalization of the military. Our retention rates in Vietnam era were about 15%. In other words, of the people who joined, about 85% left us and 15% stayed. Today, it's more that if you complete your first term, and 70% generally complete that first term, 50% plus will stay with us. And that's had a tremendous impact on the quality of the force, and goes at a time when the technology requires that kind of retention. We are not talking about 6 weeks of crawling through the mud, give them a rifle and send them to the front line. That's what you're seeing in the Russian situation. We're talking about, in some cases, years of training to master planes, master nuclear submarines. It's a vastly different. My own writing on this subject is critical of the military because we are throwing away talent. We have procurement specialists, for instance, today, that if they don't make flag, general officer, we send them home at 52 years of age. The best thing we can say is they become contractors or they move to the civil service, but they're out of the military at 52. Our allies, their colleagues would serve until the late 50s, and there is no reason that they should not be serving until the late 50s. If you join the military today out of high school at 18, we'll force you out as an enlisted man at 38 and then pay you a pension for the rest of your life and health benefits for you and your immediate family for the rest of your life. What a waste of human resources. We have a variety of programs that we could implement today to expand our accessions. The standards we have today are arbitrary standards that cream to minimize the amount of disruption in the force. Minimize, what's the cost of minimizing that? Of not bringing into the force people who would be superb soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, because they might require a waiver which we don't want to give or whatever. The standards we have today are not the standards that won World War II. World War II, we brought in Cat 4s. There's no Cat 4s, the mental group Cat 4, in the military today. And that could be expanded. There have been programs or suggestions to expand recruiting to the Dreamers. We're not doing that today. To say nothing of immigrants, illegal or not. If you're in this country, you are required to register with Selective Service, whether you're legal or not, whether you have a green card or not. So you might be drafted if we had a draft, but we won't let you enlist. Okay? My successor, David Chu's son, desperately wanted to be an ROTC, but he is a type 1 diabetic and could not join. And his father, being the Undersecretary of Defense, had no leverage on the system, if anything, a spotlight that prevented him from doing that. If he had joined and became a type 1 diabetic the next day after joining, he would be able to stay. We allow recruiters to guarantee an occupation and a duty assignment. Well, that guarantee of occupation, if it's not in the infantry or in the combat arms, means you will not be put in a combat situation because you've never been trained for a combat situation. So we know how to do that. And yet we recruit against a physical standard that expects you to be a combat soldier. We could recruit against the standard of the occupation you're going into and blow this wide open, but we don't do that. The biggest problem we have is complacency and the fear of doing anything different, because if it doesn't work out, then they'll criticize you, but if you can hide behind history, then it ain't your fault. And so there is a myriad of ways that we could increase our accessions at this point. But frankly, we really don't need to, because we're making up the numbers in retention and the end strengths are reasonably stable. So I take exception to the notion that the walls are crumbling and the AVF is in dire straits. It's always been, time will tell, we're in the marketplace, but if we experiment and are open to change, there's an opportunity. And some of that change is to deal with education. One of the changes in the military has been education. So in the late 90s, we were having a crisis in retention in senior ranks. And I was the undersecretary, and we were doing the 5-year quadrennial review. And we looked at the experience profiles of our senior enlisted and found that we were paying them on the basis of them being high school grads. Just like an E1, an E9 was being paid on the same kind of scale, adjusted for age. But our senior enlisted generally had associate degrees or some college or even baccalaureate degrees. And the chief petty officer of the Coast Guard had a PhD, but what the hell? And we changed that pay table. It was the first time, it was implemented by David Chu. It was the first time since the early 1970s that Congress did something other than an across-the-board pay increase. So we pay our senior enlisted as if they had at least some college, and it didn't cost us very much. In fact, it really didn't cost us anything, because there aren't very many of them. But it said to the junior enlisted, look what you can aspire to. And so it impacted their behavior even as they were looking forward. And so we pay our senior enlisted today more than we pay our junior officers. And that sustained us in terms of retention of the senior force through Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's a myriad of things that we can do. Sure. A shout out quickly for our DoD partners, because they supported me at RAND. RAND has 4 FFRDCs, and there are personnel research programs at every every one of them. We know more about this labor force than any company in the world knows about their labor force.
No question, no doubt about it. Well, at this stage in the game, too, there certainly the standards debate is one that is going to ebb and flow an awful lot because, again, there's an awful lot of bitter memories of challenges that spawn this, and then there are other circumstances where, as you've just cited, plenty of conditions in which we have missed the opportunity for really maintaining, if not recruiting initially, some extraordinary citizens among us who would love to serve otherwise. So this is going to be a continuing debate, and one that absolutely is going to focus on the demographic cliff issue and so forth, that not only higher education is confronting, but that also has a profound impact on the all-volunteer force and the eligibility, depending on how it's defined, exactly as you've alluded, Bernie, going forward. What's also changed in the course of this time, though, is the military strategy, the whole focus of what we assess to be the world condition, the global imperatives that force a different configuration. So much of what was devised in the all-volunteer force for its first 25 years was still during the drawdown of the force as well during the Cold War, and a continuing effort to try to confront that strategic focus with a force that would be capable of taking on a very different kind of military threat that we've assessed as part of the strategy today. In the post-Cold War atmosphere, much of the drawdown of the size of the force, which is easily 30-40% below what it was at the top of the Cold War time frame, that has relieved some of the pressure on
Absolutely.
the number of recruits and so forth, but also has changed, though, the focus of what proficiency needs to be on a wider range of very technical as well as complex capabilities. So there's been a transition and an evolution in that regard that has really contributed to this as well. And today's great power competition that seems to be beginning to rise yet again as a consequence of what we thought and hoped would be a new world order that would not look like what we're seeing now. It nonetheless continues to be a threat, and one that has made the uncertainty a difficult time to make those kinds of very critical personnel decisions on exactly what do we need to look at in the future of capability, what do we need to be prepared for. And we're now sorting through those challenges, is what's demonstrated in the national security strategy each year, is that evolving and continuing change to that. How much of an impact do you think that really ought to be?
Well, it has a strong impact in the sense that the structure of our military is vastly different than it was when the all-volunteer force was created. Mm-hmm. We've gone through a series of, if I can put my economist hat, of labor substitutions. And some of that is with contractors. Tasks that in World War II were done by people in uniform today are being done by contractors. And that's an important part. When we went to war after 9/11, DoD civilians were an important component. So the contractor force, the civilian force, and the residual military force is critical. And we've done a lot of labor capital substitutions. The productivity of our weapon systems is amazing. And you're seeing it in things like HIMARS being used in today's war, having a profound impact on the Russians, and the amount of shells have to be fired by traditional artillery and the like. So all of that changes, And that represents a challenge to our school system, military school system, but potentially the civilian school system. This is the most educated force. I once made a presentation to a group at the Aspen Institute that was looking at commitments to vocational training. And the poster boy in Europe was Mercedes-Benz, and their commitment, which represented about 5% of their budget, to training, both apprenticeship training and continued training. And using the DoD budget and the like, tried to make a sense of what was our commitment to training, both individual training and group training, unit training. It's about 30% of the budget. It's huge. We recruit people without any incorporation of their specific training backgrounds. Everybody takes the same basic training course, the same basic electronics course if they're moving into that, and we move them through. We have an officer force that generally have, almost universally, have master's degrees, if not more. And here is a tremendous opportunity for private universities, because that's, to a fair extent, a monopoly of the military service colleges. And we have the War College, and we have the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and it goes on and on. We take people who have a potential of serving with us by age of 3 years or so, and we make an investment of one of those 3 years, we send them to the War College. I don't know why we're sending them to the War College, because they're not going to be with us more than another 2 years, but we do that. We have an opportunity to better structure that with the support of private universities in the middle of the career, because if we change the career length, which we need to do, we could put much more content in a career, including more formalized education. If you said to a naval officer today, would you rather go to the PG school or another naval assignment? The answer, naval assignment. Why? Because you have a higher probability of being promoted. If we could stop that, there are plenty of places where better cooperation needs to be, but we need to address that in the structure of a military career, both in the length and the way we run promotion boards.
Mm-hmm. No question. Those are the kinds of debates that go on regularly, no doubt about that. You were a student veteran right here at Syracuse University. How might you recommend that today's leadership think differently about how to engage higher education, how to focus on the activities? You just began to touch on that a bit, of looking at different phases or differing phases of exposure to advanced degrees as well as completion of curriculum.
Absolutely. Well, I absolutely applaud what this building represents and the commitment to veterans. That's a moral commitment, and it goes over to the volunteer force in terms of the guarantee that we will take care of you. But I've heard little today or the last few days about that in terms of people coming in to the military or people being sustained in the military. Mm-hmm. So how did our senior enlisted get bachelor's degrees and associate degrees? They got it while they were in the military. And we had a big fight when I was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. There were some comptroller types, not to pick on you, John, who said, this isn't important to us. Why are we spending money sending people to school? And the answer is, you're spending money because they have higher retention and lower discipline rates and higher promotion rates. Mm-hmm. So we need to better integrate educational opportunities into the career. And in my way of thinking, there's plenty of headroom in that career if we extend it out to a more natural age. We've talked about revolutions in procurement affairs in the military. That revolution is being managed by people who are working largely in a personnel system designed in 1948 and hasn't substantially changed. And where did that personnel system come from in 1948? The Army system. It came from the Navy system from the Depression, because the Army system going into World War II was a complete failure, and Eisenhower recognized it, so they adopted the up-or-out system rather than the seniority system that was characteristic of the Army. So we're really working in a personnel structure that's kind of almost 100 years old. And we've been loath to really take on the fundamental questions. We talk about human resources. I would submit there are two kinds of issues in human resources. One are transactional. How do you get paid? How do you fill out the forms? And then there's a strategic human resources. And that is really, how do you design the system? And invariably, we spend very little time. The answer of how we designed the system is, how was it designed yesterday? Because I'm going to just continue it. My biggest issue as undersecretary was, what is the personnel structure going to look like in reality 20 years from now when we go to war against who knows what? And the chiefs of staff and of the services were much more focused on things like, how do I not break promises to today's soldiers tomorrow? So we had a lot of demand for, oh, I'm a great captain, why don't you leave me be captain, and you forced me out? And the answer is, yeah, I forced you out because 10 years from now you'll be a 45-year-old captain, and that's not what we want. And I have to worry about the movement of people through the force against a potential war sometime in the future. Whenever that occurs, we need to be prepared. And so we have a whole range of flexibilities that you can't have in the civilian world. Mm-hmm. I could fire people because they get too old. You can't do that at the university. It's age discrimination, right? Not a problem for the DOD, and we do it regularly. But in doing it, we throw the baby out with the bathwater because we have an opportunity to keep the better. We're throwing FAOs out in their early 50s, foreign area officers. It makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. But it's what we have.
Well, in addition to the sage advice that the controller community needs more enlightened leadership, I got that. Let's flip the equation a bit and talk a little bit about what higher education can do.
Yes.
To be responsive and to really think in terms of much more dynamic kinds of programming to look at what is it that can be most constructive contribution.
There have been
talent training.
There have been a number of startup universities and traditional universities that have built programs that facilitate active duty deployed service members getting higher education. Mm-hmm. But that's not been the norm, and it's not been the top universities. And you have to know your potential clients and accommodate them. So if I might, we heard yesterday about how there are programs here at Syracuse that support active duty, and they can dial in to an ongoing course And we said, is this self-paced? No, the professor has a time, you have to dial in. Well, that's not the way military schedules are. When I was more active than I am now, education was done on video discs. Today, we have the internet and the like, but you've got to be able to accommodate the environment that deployed forces and schedule. And it's not just deployed overseas. If you're out in a training exercise, you'd be out for 2 weeks. Well, that was the 2 weeks that the professor was giving the exam, and you lose the exam. You have to be able to accommodate those kinds of things.
Well, but that also requires a two-way street dialogue with the consumer in this case being the Defense Department.
Absolutely.
To really understand what the dynamism is of that scheduling requirement. And then you can adapt to that. But higher education is agile enough, from what I've seen, in terms of the range of education programs, to be responsive for where the demand arises, or where
Not always.
No, there are certainly exceptions. It's not an absolute statement, but it nonetheless is one that has evolved a lot, just in the course of the last few decades, to see how an attempt is made to be responsive in those kind of situations. So, thinking creatively and trying to imagine in higher education how to understand what the demand is, and then try to provide that capability while in service is important. But at the same time, again, I commend you for the observation that it is an incumbent responsibility on us as the public to support those who have served, so that when they
Absolutely.
are in a position where they're making a transition from the service, they can still be contributors to that broader requirement. And we owe them the opportunity to support veterans who typically make more reliable workforce, diligent folks in the context of that at a time when this is really critical. It really helps an awful lot to see programs emerging that really are in strong support of what our communities could use, which is the incredible experience that veterans do bring.
And it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
We require, for promotion in the Office Corps, basically require advanced degrees. But we do not provide an adequate window in the career profile to get that degree. If we could redo that, put the promotion profile on hold for a year or 2 years or 3 years, where an officer went to a university, got an advanced degree, and then would readjust his year group so that he didn't lose out, that would give us a better quality officer, at the same time an opportunity for the university. But you cannot do that within the structure of today's careers. If you place all of the time to be a junior officer and then to be an XO on a destroyer and then go to school to be a captain of the destroyer and then face your promotion board, there is no excess time. And we need to open that up to create excess time. That would be a tremendous opportunity to share those possibilities with universities.
No question about it, no doubt. Well, in the short time we've got left here, and again, this has been an ambitious agenda to try to cover this waterfront, to set the framework for much of the discussion that will follow here during the course of this day. In thinking about what university opportunities are, and thinking back to my time as chancellor at Louisiana State University, there was an awesome legacy there, as well as there is here, to the rooting of so much of what the nation looked for in terms of capabilities to be educated and brought through the opportunities of higher education here at Syracuse University in the post-World War II period when the drawdowns were occurring, again in the post-Cold War period. It's got a critical history in that respect. At LSU, it was one of the top 3 public institutions that produced large classes in the officer corps year after year, in which the ROTC cadets were among the top 2 or 3 universities of producing the kinds of efforts there. How do we really engage universities to be thinking more in terms of those kind of models? Because even there, at places like LSU and Texas A&M and others that have been very much involved over the course of decades to producing folks in the officer corps, that has reduced over time because the demand has dropped, as well as the fact that there's a wider range of opportunities out there. But engaging universities to actively embrace those programs that help on the front end of this, because often here at Syracuse, several members who are in the ROTC are still actively participating, are also folks that have already received assignments within the military that they're going forward with, and in many cases with graduate degrees, for law degree, for a variety of different opportunities, they're being extended in the course of that time. How much does that matter, that the officer corps be as diversified as what it needs to be in terms of the university participation?
Well, I'm going to say something maybe to the opposite. When I was Undersecretary of the Army, I was approached to support an expansion of ROTC. And I said no. And I said no because I favored OCS.
Okay, that's fair.
And I favored it because West Point in ROTC takes an 18-year-old kid who we really know nothing about, who may or may not graduate in whatever major, vice our ability to recruit directly somebody with a degree, a graduate with a proven degree in a specific subject that we may need. And I felt that we needed to have a better balance between OCS and ROTC.
That's a fair point, and that does require, from the department's view.
Look, we run a system that goes back to the Middle Ages, that distinguished between enlisted and the landed gentry who became officers. There's no reason to do that. We have the Israeli military, everybody comes in as a private, and then they sort themselves out. Our paramilitary police departments do not hire 18-year-olds off the street to be police lieutenants. They come up through the ranks. But we do that. And largely our officer corps is chosen when they're 18 years old and we know nothing about them. Excuse me, that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to me. But that is the tradition we have, and I don't see it changing very quickly.
Sure, but it is indeed born of the citizen-soldier prospect from the very founding of the Republic that says everybody ought to have an equal opportunity to do this, which brings us back to where we started with this. So in that regard, Bernie, I want to thank you again for your many years of unbelievable public service, as well as the careful effort you put into really researching this particular policy in thinking through those challenges, and again the opportunity to continue that debate over as many years as vigorously as you have. Thank you.
Well, and back to you, and congratulations on the recognition you share. Your career is unmatched.
Well, hardly, but I thank you very much and appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thank you.